Yeah. And what a great way to begin when we're going to be talking about pain. I mean, it's easy to feel the love of God in a moment like this. Can we feel it in a moment like that? I need to ask you a very important question this morning. Have you ever smashed your finger in a car door? I have. This one. The year's 1971, the event in 1971, and this was probably in all the papers, my first car date. And Rebecca Lynn Hoskett, little blonde, blue-eyed, pure as the driven snow, Baptist girl, and we had the car date. At the end of the date, and it's gone perfectly, I open the door, she seats herself, I close the door with some authority, inexplicably leaving my finger in the upper left-hand corner of the door. Kaboom! And it was in there in a way that I could not withdraw it without opening the door, risking the fact that she might see how incredibly stupid I am. She didn't notice. Opened the door, and in the light of the street lamp, I could see what looked like a raw piece of flank steak with blood dripping steadily on my shoe. This is one definition of pain. It's that sensation that comes when we're physically hurt. We have that in common. It unites us as a people. Sometimes it's self-inflicted, like when you slam your finger in a door or you drop something heavy on your foot. Sometimes it's visited upon us when a bee stings us or a former friend shoots us with a paintball. We all have these moments when we grit our teeth and we tough it out. But the equity ends there. Pain is not evenly distributed through the populace. Have you noticed this? Some people can go through life, long life, happy life, peacefully to the grave, having never broken a bone. Ever break a femur? You know what the femur is? It's the biggest bone in the human body, right? The strongest bone in the human body. I've broken both of those. I think the jaw is the third strongest bone in the body. Broke that in 5 places. And then, there's the other typical, the wrist and the arm and that stuff. And then surgeries associated with each of these, sometimes more than one. And then speaking of surgeries, there was the one where I almost cut my foot off, and so they had to go in and try to reattach nerves and blood supply and tendons and muscles and all of that stuff. And then a year later, they needed to go back and try to stretch my Achilles because my foot was frozen in a downward position. Try water skiing that way sometime. Then the elbow surgery and the knee surgery, a couple of those, and of course, 4 back surgeries. So not exactly as tough as maybe an NFL running back, but I've had my share of physical pain. And for most of us, we can take a certain amount of pain in stride. It's not that big a deal. Natural consequences. It's my mistake or somebody's mistake. It's an accident. But then, there comes that point where it seems like enough's enough. We hit this certain threshold of pain and we start to feel ganged up on. It's the late 80s and I'm a youth pastor. And I've taken my gang of kids and sponsors and workers to what was then the poorest state in the United States, Kentucky. We went to the poorest county in Kentucky, and so we're deep in the Appalachians, and we've got kids going out to 3 houses that we're going to try to fix up and help some very needy people. And the job that I'm on this morning has to do with rehabbing, replacing really a porch and front steps that are in very seriously bad condition. And the biggest thing on the porch is a couch. If you've ever been to rural Kentucky, you know that every porch is covered with old furniture and junk. So you got to de-junk the porch. The couch is about 9 feet long. It's about 3 feet deep. It has rained the night before. It's upholstered, so it's full of water. It's dripping with water. It weighs 1.2 million pounds. And I'm looking around for somebody to help me. The teenagers are hiding behind the house or hiding in the house. I see 2 high school guys, and it's like, come here. You guys get on the end of the couch. I'm on the other end, right? I'm young and I'm strong. We're all going to lift with our legs. And we get this thing up. And then we I started back, and we go across the porch, down the steps. My feet hit terra firma, and I think this is going pretty well. Started to edge around the house, and everything's on a hill down there, right? It's kind of like Dubuque. I mean, steep, grassy hill, wet grass from the rain the night before. Still doing very well until I hit that spot where the old lady would throw her bacon grease out the kitchen window every morning. And when my feet hit that, they went out from under me, and I fall, and the couch falls on my slightly twisted lower body. And something happens to my back that day that has hurt every day since. You know, thinking about this, I thought at the time I was in the center of God's will, right? And kids' lives are being changed, and we're helping significantly needy people. And I'm laying on my back in the wet grass, smelling slightly of bacon, looking at the sky, saying, really, God? You know, and then surgery number 1 was then. And a year later, surgery number 2 and 3, and recently surgery number 4. And I'm thinking, seriously, you know, what is this all about? Is this all really necessary? And don't we wish that physical pain was the only pain there was? But if we're going to be straight with each other, and we will, then we know there's other kinds of pain. For instance, the pain of labels and judgment. Divorced. There's a label. It's painful. And it'll get you some judgment in Christian circles, especially. Phil Yancey, in his old but excellent book, Disappointment with God, writes this on page 203. Once a friend of mine went swimming in a large lake at dusk. You know what dusk is, don't you? As he was paddling at a leisurely pace about 100 yards offshore, a freak evening fog rolled in across the water. Suddenly he could see nothing. No horizon, no landmarks, no objects, or even lights on shore. Because the fog diffused the light, he couldn't even make out the direction of the setting sun. For 30 minutes, he splashed out in great circles, in panic. He would start off in one direction, lose confidence, turn 90 degrees to the right, later 90 degrees to the left. It didn't really make any difference. He could feel his heart racing uncontrollably. He would stop and float on his back and try to conserve energy. And he'd force himself to breathe slower. And then he'd blindly strike out again. At last, he heard a faint voice calling from shore. He pointed his body toward the sound and followed it to safety. And then Phil goes on to relate this to an incident in the Old Testament with Job. But in 1992, something like that sensation of utter lostness settled in on me. I'm sitting at the kitchen table trying to make sense of these papers that arrived in a registered letter, papers from her lawyer, trying to comprehend what was happening. And I too had lost all landmarks, all points of orientation. And it seemed like there was no human with a clue how to help me. And God, who could guide me through the fog, seemed strangely silent, like my prayers were just bouncing off the ceiling. By the time you get to be my age, you've suffered some loss. There's another form of pain. I mean, it's just natural life cycle, right? I've lost all four grandparents now. And lost my mom last year and several friends through the years. Accident, injury, death from disease. One example, when I was 17, I lost my best friend. Mike was the wildest friend I had in high school. And I didn't really have any wild friends, and Mike really wasn't that wild. It's just that I was this straight Baptist kid, and we had endless conversations about my church-going ways, which made it all the more awesome when he prayed with me one night and gave his life to Jesus in the family room in the basement of our house, right at the end of the ping pong table. 3 months later, there's this terrible accident. It's a youth canoe trip, and we're on this together with a bunch of other kids. Our wooden canoe is smashed to pieces, and 3 of us go into the cold, deep, muddy current of the Little Miami River, and only 2 would come out. And every morning for over a year, when I'd wake up, 2 realities would wash over me. One, he was really gone. The nightmares were real. And 2, the sense of guilt that I had another day to live and his days were gone. This next one might be the most painful. Have you ever failed? Epic failure, noticeable failure. People saw it. You were embarrassed. You were humiliated. 20 years ago, when I was all disoriented, when the fog had rolled in, I thrashed around. And I started swimming toward, maybe some church that God would prepare somewhere that would, by some miracle, understand my situation and still want me. That was not to be. Any church that I was interested in serving was not looking for a pastor with a divorce on his resume. And so now I felt like ministry was a closed door, that I'd failed. So I gave up and I dog paddled for a while. And later I struck out in the direction of my natural sales ability. I discovered early that people don't have much respect for an ex-pastor selling cars. I had no idea in my naivete how cliche that was. And so I quickly worked my way into management. But when I realized that the dealerships all too often wanted me to train the salespeople to deceive the consumer, the fog rolled in and the lost feeling returned. At some point I started traveling. I had started at the bottom of this young insurance company, and I was one of 70 salespeople traveling in 3 rural states, cold calling farmers. I actually did pretty well at it in, I think it was 6 months. I was promoted to recruiter, and in less than a year, VP of personnel. Not too long after that, administrative vice president. On my 5-year anniversary with the company, the CEO and his wife invited Shell and I on an all-expense-paid trip to Cancun for a week, and we spent that week with them. On the last night, they took us to dinner, and at the end of the meal, he produced a small, green, expensive-looking box with a familiar logo on it and gives me a Rolex. And then he tells this really cool story about all the things that I've accomplished in the 5 years that he'd known me, and he asks me to be the president of the company. It says that he wants to step back and let me have the reins. He makes a lot more money that way. That was a surreal moment. I mean, I honestly felt like it was an out-of-body experience. And I thought back through the highs and lows of my life, and just in wonder. I mean, the security that came with that. No more worrying about finances, college education, cars for the kids, retirement, all of that stuff done at a relatively young age. And life was going to be real good. About a year and a half later, the CEO calls a high-level meeting, just him, the other VPs, and me. 5 people in a room, the boardroom. And he has this big new deal, and he puts it on the table. It requires my signature, and I had seen it before. And we had discussed this, and I didn't want to sign it because I felt like it was unethical. So here was again, and we had considerable discussion. Toward the end, he indicates This is a very big deal. This is a very profitable deal. It takes us in a new direction. And he needs, quote, a little loyalty here. I look around the table and I speak to the loyalty issue and how important it is. I agree. There's almost nothing as important, especially in this setting, than loyalty, unless perhaps it might be morality. Don't think he took that very well. And at the end of the meeting, he literally takes a show of hands as to which is more important, loyalty for wimpy Weasley hands, or this ethics thing, he called it. I felt set up. I felt betrayed. Had this sense of foreboding, and a week later, I was fired. One sentence and gone. Now that was a surreal moment. That was an out-of-body experience. And I watched myself walk down this long hallway with a little cardboard box, past all the glass where the girls sat, my girls, all the administrative pool, looking at each other in horror and like, what is going on? And I went to my car and drove home for the last time. You know the part in the movies where the hero screams at the sky? Or this, they pound their fist through the mirror. Have you ever seen a drama where somebody at some time didn't put their fist through the mirror? You know, I was in that place. And I just wanted to know if he was paying attention. Seriously, I mean, are you watching this? Are you aware of what's going on here? Or is this some cosmic joke that I'm going to get later and we'll laugh? See, it just wasn't amusing to me. As a guy who's experienced his share of time in the fog, let me recommend something to you. Get some perspective. Get some perspective. And I want to look for a moment at a guy who's suffered pain that makes my pain look like a hangnail. Then the Lord said to Satan, Lord Satan, those two people, have you considered my servant Job? There's no one on earth like him. He's blameless and upright, a man who fears God and shuns evil. Does Job fear God for nothing? Satan replied, have you not put a hedge around him and his household and everything he has? Have you not blessed the work of his hands so that his flocks and herds are spread throughout the land? But now stretch forth your hand and strike him. Take away that stuff, and he will surely curse you to your face. Satan's position is that people like Job only follow God because they are, in a sense, bribed to do so. And that if you take that reward away, you take that stuff away, they will quickly abandon him. And there are some people like that. Fortunately for our exposition this morning, Job is not one of them. When God accepts the challenge to test Satan's theory, in essence, agreeing to let Job's response settle this issue, talk about faith. That's God's faith in man, in Job. The calamities begin to rain down on poor, unsuspecting Job. Now, as you probably know, when people are in pain, when the trouble comes, the questions pour out. We're not the first ones to be that way. In fact, the questions that we have in difficult times are but faint echoes of the questions that tormented Job. It's basically, why me and what's going on? That kind of covers it. I know there's a lot more questions, but that's basically it, right? Job is angry. Job is sarcastic. Job feels betrayed. And he wanders as close to blasphemy as he can possibly get. I mean, right out to the edge, toes hanging over, leaning forward. And the questions sound so familiar because if we haven't said them ourselves, we've definitely thought them. Job's voice gives a voice. Job's questions give voice to the stuff the complaints, the things that we have against God. But chapters 1 and 2, the prologue of this thing, prove that regardless of what Job thinks, God is not on trial here. Job is on trial. The point of the book is not pain, where is God when it hurts? The point is faith. Where is Job when it hurts? How is Job responding? And Job is in the dark. This is my favorite verse for years. I thought that was going to make this my life verse. Yet when I hoped for good, evil came. When I looked for light, then came darkness. The churning in me never stops. Have you ever felt the churning? So his friends try to enlighten him. Oh, what a crew of buddies he had. His wife tells him to curse God and die. This was very helpful. And then there's 35 chapters. 35 chapters of arguing and complaining and whining. And finally, God arrives in a storm. Now that's another sermon. But sometimes God arrives in a storm. But he has come in person to reply to Job's accusations of unfairness. Then the Lord spoke to Job. Wow. The Lord spoke to Job. Out of the storm, he said, "Who is this that obscures my plans with words without knowledge?" Why do you confuse the issue, Job and friends? Why do you talk without knowing what you're talking about? Now, this isn't exactly what we're expecting, is it? When God finally gets there to respond to this, we're thinking of several helpful things God could have said, like, Job, I'm truly sorry about what's happened. You've endured a lot of stuff on my behalf, and I'm proud of you. I can't tell you what this means to me, to the generations to come, even to the universe. Nice job, a few compliments, a little compassion, maybe even a brief explanation of what's been going on behind the curtain in that unseen world. We get none of that. God says nothing of the kind. Where were you when I laid the earth's foundation? Tell me if you understand. Who marked off its dimensions? Surely you know. Who stretched a measuring line across it? On what were its footings set? Who laid the cornerstone when the morning stars sang together and all the angels shouted for joy? Imagine being an angel in heaven when God is creating stuff. Probably some applause going on. Who shut up the sea behind doors when it burst forth from the womb? When I made the clouds its garment and wrapped it in thick darkness? When I fixed limits for it and set its doors and bars in place? When I said, this far you may come and no farther? This is where your proud waves halt. Let me ask you a question, Job. Have you ever given orders to the morning or shown the dawn its place, that it could take the earth by the edges and shake the wickedness out of it? How exactly do you respond to those questions? There's lots more. In his book, Wishful Thinking, Frederick Buechner sums up God's speech. God doesn't explain, he explodes. He asks Job who he thinks he is anyway. He says that to try and explain the kind of things that Job wants explained would be like trying to explain Einstein to a little neck clam. God doesn't reveal his grand design, he reveals himself. And the message, if I could boil it down, is this. Until you know a little bit more about running the physical universe, Job, don't come to me trying to tell me how to run the moral universe. And the impact of God's speech on Job is as amazing as the speech itself. Although God never answers question 1 about Job's predicament, this storm flattens Job, literally and figuratively. It's like he's rebooted or something. He's a different guy instantly. God has revealed himself. Ask anybody in the fog. Ask anybody in pain. When God shows up, It helps. It makes a lot of difference. Job repents in dust and ashes, and every trace of irritation or disappointment in God vanishes. Then Job replied to the Lord, I know that you can do all things. No purpose of yours can be thwarted. You asked, who is this that obscures my plans without knowledge? Surely I spoke of things I did not understand, things too wonderful for me to know. You said, listen now, and I will speak, I will question you, and you will answer me. My eyes had heard of you. My ears had heard of you, but now my eyes have seen you. Therefore, I despise myself. I repent in dust and ashes. I'm not going to talk anymore. If you look to the book of Job for answers to the why questions, you will come away disappointed. God declined to answer. Job withdrew his questions. And he and all three of his friends repent of all their wrong assumptions. And in case you're wondering, tiny rabbit trail here, Jesus avoided the issue also. When the disciples drew certain conclusions about a man born blind in John chapter 9, and later when they drew certain conclusions about two catastrophes that had happened in this local area, Jesus rebuked them. It was like, where do you get this stuff? Why would you think that? So from the evidence that I could find in the Bible, I've got to conclude that the answers, specific answers to the why questions, are simply out of reach for us locked in time and space. Old Testament or New, God deflects the questions of cause and refocuses on our response of faith. And see, this is more than childlike faith, you can tell, huh? Childlike faith may not survive if the miracle doesn't come. You know those people as well. When the fog rolls in and hides every evidence that God cares or even exists, that kind of faith dissipates. It's like the difference between Psalm 23 and Psalm 22. Y'all know Psalm 23, right? Very comforting. Most comforting scripture in Scripture. But have you ever read the psalm right before it? Let me give you 2 verses of that. My God, why have you forsaken me? Why are you so far from saving me, so far from my cries of anguish? My God, I cry out by day, but you do not answer. By night, but I find no rest. Psalm 23 models childlike faith. Psalm 22 models something deeper, faith, profound loyalty. Fidelity is a musty old word for faithfulness that probably works real well here. And our lives with God will include some of both. We may experience times of unusual closeness. You know, when every prayer is answered in an obvious way, and God seems close and caring and intimate. And then they're going to experience the fog times when God seems silent, when nothing goes according to plan, when all the Bible promises seem glaringly false, or at least they don't apply to me. In both times, God still reigns and has not abandoned us, no matter how it appears. 20 years ago, I sat alone in the most depressing apartment you've ever seen. This was before the divorce. I was after the divorce, but before God blessed me with my angel wife, Michelle. And long before we brought Andina de Luisa de Bebisita into the world. This was a darker time. I sat alone at a kitchen table, Bible open in front of me, little wet spot on the page where one kind of half-angry tear had dripped off my nose. And as I close my eyes and I think about that scene, as I remember that moment in the kitchen, I would swear that the room was full of fog. That's the way I remember it. And I'm trying to talk to God. I'm not entirely sure He's listening. And I'm saying, somehow between you and me, we've got me on this shelf. I'm in the back corner of the warehouse. I'm completely useless to you and your kingdom. And it's really the only thing I care about. 5 years ago, I had that rags to riches thing, and now I was well on my way to rags again. And I'm in my desk, my beautiful solid oak roll-top desk, in my study, in my beautiful brick home that I'm about to sell. Bible open in front of me, trying to read, but thinking, this is so unfair. Doesn't make any sense to me. Oh, how it would pour over the details of the past 4 or 5 years. Couldn't get it to make sense from any perspective. I said to God, you're robbing my family. Look at the things they're about to lose. There goes the college education. There goes the big insurance policy. There goes retirement and security for the future. Now my son can't drive the Beamer to prom. That's how stupid I am, and that's the kind of stuff that I was saying to God. And the passage I was reading, it was in Genesis. I was reading about Abraham, and the last verse of the passage I was reading was chapter 18, verse 25. And the last 10 words in that passage that I read that morning was, will not the judge of all the earth do right? And my soul said, yeah. And it was more recently than I want you to know that I lay on my raggedy old ice pack with my feet elevated at a stage where the pain had eclipsed the medication once again, asking God, how does this help really? What's the benefit of this exactly? This is making it hard for me to be loving to my family. Hard to function for them and for the church and the community that you've called me to. And somehow Job's words just kind of filtered into me from ages past. Though he slay me, yet will I hope in him. There's no better way for us to express our love for God than by exercising unshakable trust, loyalty, fidelity to Him. This is one place where stubbornness is a virtue. Job would not let go. No matter how he felt, no matter how it looked, no matter what his friends said or his wife said, I will trust him. My wife and I have this little thing we do. Like if we're signing a card or a letter, sometimes even on a sticky note. So you could be rummaging around in my kitchen, Snoop, looking at my stuff and find maybe a little card or letter or sticky note that said, you know, Shell, I'm going to be a little bit late, but I'll pick up the milk, FNW. And you'd be thinking, oh, now we got a problem. Some guy named FNW has been just a little bit too familiar with Rick's wife. But FNW stands for forever, no matter what. And with the experiences that we've had, you know, a little permanence, a little fidelity, a little security says a lot. And if we can love humans, if we have the capacity to love that way, anyone that way, perhaps we should love him that way. Ever notice how in the Old Testament the writers, the prophets, some of the psalmists, they speak of pain and hard times a lot like Job, you know? They're angry, they're questioning, they have bitterness and indignation. But when the New Testament guys speak of pain and suffering, it's all momentary affliction and joy and tribulation. There's pain in the New Testament, and it's acknowledged and it's discussed, but you don't hear the questions. You don't hear the whining. Instead, they keep pointing to two events, the death of Jesus and the resurrection of Jesus. Regarding his death, Hebrews says he offered up prayers and petitions with loud cries and tears to the one who could save him from death. Ladies and gentlemen, boys and girls, there was no rescue. He lost his life. It was almost as if God is not willing to put us through any trial or test that he hasn't endured himself. Regarding his resurrection, the apostles' faith, as they so often confessed, rested entirely on what happened on Easter Sunday. This is when God transformed the greatest pain and the greatest tragedy in all of history, the execution of his Son, into a day that we now celebrate as Good Friday. The disciples learned in 3 days what they failed to learn in 3 years. That when God seems absent, he may be the closest of all. And when God seems dead to us, he may be about to spring to life. Faith means believing in advance what will only make sense in reverse. When Jesus rose from the dead, did the disciples feel better? Yes, they did. Did this whole crucifixion thing make a little more sense in reverse to them? Absolutely. Faith means believing in advance what will only make sense in reverse. Faith requires trusting God when there is no evidence of him, just as Job did. And so whatever our circumstance, can we live today as if God is loving and gracious and merciful and all-powerful, even while the blinders of time and space are obscuring our vision? Can we hang on knowing that the judge of all the earth will do right? Can we hang on knowing that there's a resurrection and it will bring resolution, and that all these unfair things will end at some point? Can we hang on knowing that ultimately there's going to be this moment when this whole thing is played in reverse, and we all say, amazing, unbelievable, I never saw that coming?